Juan?
All right, thank you, Elizabeth, and everybody who asked questions. So now we're gonna do our cultural responsiveness training from Mass Mentoring Partnership. And Janine, who is their will be leading the training. I've made them co-hosts, so Janine, you should be able to do that now.
Yes.
Is there anyone else who would need co-hosting?
Yes, if Beth Frester, my colleague, is on the line, if you can make her a co-host as well. Okay. All right, can folks hear me just okay? Great, and I'm not sure if Juan is frozen or not.
I think he's a little frozen.
Okay, all right, I wasn't sure if it was me or him, so I can go ahead and start sharing my screen so we can get going with the presentation.
Thank you.
Juan. So let's
Can I become a co-host also? I'm Beth Frester.
Yeah, I wonder if Juan was frozen, got frozen in the process of making Beth the co-host. Okay, there she goes. Awesome. Beth, I think sharing my screen will be okay for now. So I'm going to
trying to be able to move into.
Perfect. We can see the slides.
Wonderful. Okay. All right, so we are going to go ahead and get started. And you can see my slides. Beth is getting queued up and everything. But as you're going, you probably already did this already. One request for Juan and Antonia, for breakout rooms, I think one of us need to be actually the host and not just co-host. So can you make Beth Frester the host, please, so that we can use the breakout function? Thank you. All right, so while we're doing that and working out the technical difficulties and whatnot, I want to say welcome. My name is Janine Smith. I'm the Senior Manager of Program Services at Mass Mentoring Partnership. And I was wondering if folks don't mind, you may have done this earlier, but we don't know who you are. If you wouldn't mind just sharing in the chat box your name, the program that you're coming from, and if you want to share your location, like where you are physically right now. I'm in Somerville, work for Mass Mentoring, and it'll just help us kind of have some context as to who folks are, what organizations they're coming from, and how folks are doing. So if folks could go ahead and do that in the chat box, we'll be able to get a better sense of all of you. Also, I emailed it to Juan, and folks should have the workbook and the PowerPoint presentation in case you wanted to follow along. If you don't have the workbook in front of you, I understand there's challenges of printing or having dual screens. At the very least, we just ask that people have like a sheet of paper and a pen or a pencil to be able to do some of the activities or take notes with them today. I'll also put the link for the workbook in the chat so you can access it live. It's a Google Doc, so you should be able to do that as well.
Sorry, Janine, to butt in real quick. So I made you the host, but now I can't make Beth the host. So I think you might have to do that on your own. My bad.
Okay, all right, there you go. That's not a problem. I'm gonna stop share really quickly just so I can see that and go ahead and make.
So why don't I share?
I just made you the host, Beth. I'm doing it right now.
Okay.
There you go. All right. So. Okay. Actually, you do have to share as the host because attendee screen sharing is not enabled. I'm now an attendee. So go ahead and share your screen and run us along. Great. Okay, great. So you're here for a cultural responsiveness training with us at Mass Mentoring Partnership. We want to get started. We'll walk you through the agenda, kind of explain our purpose for today, the objectives. We understand the work that you do coaching and supporting young people, to persist in college, and want to just have some conversations and some dialogue today about thinking about a lens for how do I best support those young people, affirming who they are, supporting them to be able to get through and persist using relationships.
Great. And I noticed in the chat box that we know some of you and some of you may know us. So it's nice to see some familiar faces. Yay! As we're all stuck in our homes. But for those of you who don't know Mass Mentoring, let me give you a quick 2-second overview. Mass Mentoring is a statewide organization. So we go coast to coast, from left to right, up and down, the Cape, from the Cape to Gloucester, from Western Mass, so all the way to the Berkshires. And we do our work in what we call relationships in action framework. So we do basically 4 things that we hope all of our work goes into those buckets. We assess, we go to communities and programs and assess how people are using relationships as a lever to bring around positive youth outcomes, and say, what are you doing? How are you doing it? Where are your strengths and where are the gaps, both from a community systemic level and from a programmatic level. And then we build by bringing training, technical assistance, and resources to the field, but we also build by bringing money and human capital to the field. And right now we're in the process of building our next AmeriCorps core program up. And we still have some openings for core members as well as host sites. So that way, but we also bring funding to the field, scholarships, and money for programs to gain some money. We also manage a $1 million grant through the state budget, through the Department of Education. So we build by bringing all the resources that people need to make sure that they're using best practices and bring research to the field. And then we connect people, we build networks. We want to bring people together because we believe that there's a lot of wisdom and experience out in the field between people. And we also want to bring people who have money and other resources to the programs that need those resources. So we want to connect people, places, and things to build a stronger and more diverse field. And then, of course, we advocate. We believe we have actually in our office a registered lobbyist, Chelsea Aquino from our government relations team. And we are looking every time things come out of the State House, our policy people actually putting their money where their mouth is and looking at policies that value relationship as a lever for positive youth outcomes. Are they putting policies and money in place to support those policies? And then we like to bring the field together to have a really robust voice to kind of keep people honest about those policies and really advocate on behalf of young people and the totality of young people. That we want to believe in relationships, but we know that young people come with other needs, and we need to look at young people and their whole lives to advocate on their behalf. So let's just look about who's who and who we are a little bit. Oops. So we have many teams at Mass Mentoring, but the program service team is who we are. And just so you know a little bit about me, I'm Beth Fraster. I am the Chief Program Officer. I come to this work with a strong belief of youth development. I've worked in the field for over 30 years, and I have always been fighting on behalf of relationships for young people, and believing that if we don't have that at the heart of the matter, then none of our work really does matter. And so I've worked across the state in many capacities. And then I went from that work here in Massachusetts to a national consulting firm to help work to develop training and technical assistance on a national level. And then as I did that work for a while, I realized that my heart was really here in Massachusetts and I wanted to get closer to my work. So I came back to Mass Mentoring, and here I am to really dive in deep and help to build a strong and connected field of youth development and youth serving organizations believing in the power of relationships. I'll turn it to Janine.
Yes, great. So just a little bit about me. I'm the Senior Manager of Program Services. As I said, I've been at Mass Mentoring for 5 years. I entered that work through AmeriCorps, serving in Boston-based mentoring organizations. From there, I left and did some work, adult programming with an organization or program called Lead Boston. So got to learn the city really well and learn about kind of different places where leaders can commit and support equity around the city. Went to grad school and determined that I wanted to do work to support organizations to be at their best and support communities through the nonprofit sector, and then landed back in mentoring at Mass Mentoring Partnership doing capacity building work. So really, I enjoy meeting, going out to your organizations, getting to know you all, and making sure and supporting that young people are getting the relationships that they deserve from us, the adults in their lives. So again, happy to see a lot of maybe familiar names or organizational names on the line, and looking forward to our time today.
Okay, so I'm assuming that by now we're pretty much Zoom experts, but just to let you all know, we're going to use the chat room as much as you want. We'll be monitoring and looking at it, ask questions, talk to each other. Just so you know, I don't know if anyone has ever said this out loud. You can talk to everyone by choosing everyone, but you can also talk to individuals by changing the everyone to a certain person. That's not, it says it's private, but it's, but it's really not private. At some point, someone can see all the conversation that's happening. I just say that because as a social worker, I take confidentiality really seriously. So it's really not private, but you can talk to each other, say whatever you want to each other, and know that somebody could look at it someday. You can stay off of your video or on your video. There's going to be times that we're going to ask you if it's comfortable to please let yourself be known, especially when you're in the small breakout rooms. We're trying to make this as interactive and as real as possible. We also know that there's challenges with connectivity. There's challenges with what feels comfortable and private with your home or wherever you're sitting, and some other issues that make it really difficult to show yourself. Do the best that you can. We ask that if you're in small spaces, if you can, feel free. It makes conversations just that much more real and exciting. We're going to keep people on mute, but we're going to ask you to get off mute because conversation matters as much as relationships do, because if we're going to have conversation, just take yourself off mute when we're asking you to speak, but keep yourself on mute to keep the background noise low. And we know that children and youngsters and partners and dogs and cats come in and out of pictures. We love it. Anything else, Janine?
No, I think we're good. We can move on to the agenda. So for our time today, we did a little welcome and introductions as best we could with 40 plus people on the line. We're gonna move into an icebreaker to continue our kind of introducing the topic and ourselves and reflection. And our topic for the 2 hours that we're here is cultural responsiveness. So we'll define what we mean by that, right? So we all have some shared language and understanding. And then we're gonna start by reflecting on our own experiences. So we're gonna do an activity that'll have you kind of understand yourselves. That is underlined specifically because we're going to be in breakout rooms, and again, ask that if you're able to turn on your camera if it's not on to share with your partners in discussion. We'll go over some things to consider, explore some other concepts, implicit bias, kind of understanding how that plays out, and thinking about throughout this relationships. So why do relationships matter? What is important about certain kinds of relationship, an empowering, intentional relationship for young people? And then we'll end with strategies to create culturally responsive relationships. So we've got a little scenario or two that we can review, and really collectively also hear from you all and thinking about the work that you're doing, because we know you already do this work, and how we can deepen our engagement and knowledge to become more culturally responsive for the young people that we serve. And so that portion also includes a breakout, and I believe we'll have one other breakout time, so that's why that's underlined as well. So that's our day. And our goals for this session, we want to examine experiences that shape our identities, assumptions, and worldview, because for us, when we think about relationship and being with young people, supporting young people, being in service to young people, we think that you need to explore your own kind of, what are you bringing to the table? What do you believe about the world, about young people, and see where those biases and worldviews show up for you. We want to identify cultural knowledge gaps and understand the effect it has on our work. So we're not here to necessarily educate you about every specific type of population you might be working with and every specific challenge that young people and communities are going through, but having a lens for, what don't I know? What do I need to understand? And then we will share some resources where you can get additional knowledge so you can kind of build your toolkit and build that awareness and skills. Define terms related to cultural responsiveness, and then start to develop an action plan, right? So start to think about, where in my practice do I think I need to learn more, do differently, do better, keep doing the great stuff that I'm doing, so that you can have the skills and knowledge to be culturally responsive. So for an icebreaker, just wanted to, do a little bit of reflection to start, and asking folks to reflect on going back to kind of the age that, your students are. So in high school, recent graduates, right? And reflecting on a time when you felt affirmed as a young person, right? Because we're going to be talking about relationships, and relationships where young people can bring their full selves, right? Relationships that are responsive to who they are and their needs. So I want you to think about, when were you in this type of relationship or situation? Maybe it was school, maybe it was in your church, in your home. Who was there to do that for you, right? Was it a youth worker? Was it an auntie? Was it, an older young person that you worked with or were in school with? And what did they do, right? What does it look like to affirm a young person? What kind of characteristics did that person have? What was special about them that let you know that you belonged and that you were important and that relationship mattered to you? So we'll give you a few moments to just reflect individually, and I would love if folks could share that in the chat. If there are a few people who want to kind of raise their hand or ping and share individually, we might take one or two folks if you want to take yourself off of mute, but we'll give you, a moment to reflect on that, and then if folks can start typing or sharing their responses, we just would like to kind of voice that and recognize that we hopefully know what this feels like, so we can identify it to be able to do this for young people in our lives. So take a little bit of time. We got to get some music or something in the future for these like dull moments on Zoom. It's not quite like when you're in real life and you kind of just, walk around.
I'm going to check something on my screen while everyone's thinking.
Okay. And so folks are reflecting. If you'd like to share, you don't have to answer all 3 questions necessarily, but there we go. I see it's coming in, right? Who was there? What did it feel like? Even if you just want to share a few words of, it felt, challenging, hard, easy, fun. Thank you. I see Leo and Kathy have shared a little. Peggy is coming in.
We have family, friends, and coaches, English teachers, a Nana.
I can share out loud if that's all right. I don't want to interrupt anyone.
Sure, no, we'll take a comment. Thank you. It's Savannah, right?
Yeah, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
In high school, I was a relatively troubled youth. I transferred schools, and when I transferred, I got involved in journalism. And my journalism teacher coach was just one of the most empathetic women I've ever met in my life. Like, people that didn't have her class or anything else would go to her, just like she was the person everyone trusted. And she's who convinced me that I just wanted to be able to offer that sort of support to youth in any way, shape, or form. And that's what I've been doing since I got into college. I'm really grateful for it.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing that.
Can I go the same route as Savannah?
Sure, thank you.
John Noel, by the way, Boston Pick. For me, it was my dean of students in my high school. Like Savannah, I got into a whole bunch of trouble. When I was young, this dean of students was also like coincidentally was like my old history teacher back in middle school. So I'm like, anybody who's familiar with like Boy Meets World, he was like Mr. Feeney in that sense. And he just pretty much guided me and kind of helped me through a lot of like troubles, and kind of became like a mentor, father figure. And I kind of like, it for me felt needed at that time. Like, looking back on it, was just something that I needed, and I kind of model my whole current coaching style after his, like, with a couple of tweaks.
Great.
Nice. Nice.
I'd like to share a story. It's kind of funny, actually. Back in high school, I played girls lacrosse, and I was really, really bad. I mean, really bad. But the person that really affirmed me as a really bad lacrosse player was my father. He would take time off from work and come to watch every single one of my games and cheer me on, even though I was sitting on the bench. And what that instilled in me was that regardless of my position on the team, I was still part of the team, and I was there to support those that were on the field at the time. And, you know, someone just said, I was there, and I kind of use that experience to meet students where they're at and let them know that regardless of their position in a class, in their family, in society, they are a valued member, and they can, achieve great things. So just knowing that my father was there in all those games cheering me on as I sat on that bench in all kind of weather was just, made me really feel valued. And I hate the sport.
Thank you so much for sharing. And thank you folks who shared in the comments. We haven't been able to read all of them aloud, but just summarizing what a lot of folks said. People who were there for you, who were consistent, who showed up, who believed in you, regardless of your position, what you were doing. You weren't great at the sport, but your dad was there every game to watch you sit on that bench, right? And folks having patience, folks really seeing young people for who they are, and meeting them where they're at. So thank you so much for sharing. I see a few more coming in. These are wonderful. And being able to, again, reflect on who was that person or persons, people who were there for you, and what those skills were, what those things, the characteristics. If we were together, we would make a list, a chart of all of the ways that adults can show up for young people, and kind of reference that as we go through the course of the training. So having that in mind, we want to think about, as we move forward, relationships that are culturally responsive, that affirm who young people are, and that build young people up to be successful throughout the course of their lives. So before we start going into the content, wanted to just be, open and just put it out there that the world is going through a lot right now, right? And to set some context around where we are, where your young people are, where our communities are, and thinking about how we not only support young people just throughout, our regular kind of work, but particularly in this moment. What we have here on our screen, you see these are COVID deaths, right? Thinking about the pandemic, COVID. per 1,000 people. This is for Massachusetts. This is across the state. And so acknowledging that for young people and their families, for some of us, right, this pandemic certainly has changed the way that we operate, the way that we are in relationship, the way that we, walk through the world in our lives. And it's important to understand the impact on our families, on the young people that we work with. I mean, we would all be here together, right, in person, building relationship, talking to each other, networking in the training. And so now we're here on a computer doing this. And so thinking about the ways that, this pandemic has impacted the young people that we work with and what that means for relationship, because it's more important than ever that we stay connected and support young people. Also thinking about the current, context of the racial justice work and uprising and police brutality and responses to that that's been happening in our world. For those of you who've been doing this work, and for certainly people of color, Black folks, this has been happening since forever, right? And yet in this moment, there seems to be either an awakening or a reawakening or some additional energy around that. And again, our young people are sitting in that context, are seeing the news, are seeing the videos, and understanding, the experiences differently, right, as it relates to their world. And so we wanted to, again, acknowledge that context, acknowledge that we're all sitting in this together, and that through relationship, there's an opportunity to support young people and families as they kind of navigate and weather, our world in the way that the world is shaping differently nowadays. Beth, did you want to add anything?
No, but I do think the moment is different for each person. And so as we put our cultural responsive lens on, we need to both look into ourselves to understand where we sit, and then put it into being able to then allow ourselves to hear where others sit. And that's going to be really important as we move forward.
And
more about that as we go forward.
Sure. And just want to also, be clear with folks that for today, our training, you saw our goals and objectives is around cultural responsiveness, which again is a lens for the way that you look at your work, the way that you build relationship with young people. We know that there's a need, and there's been more conversation around racial equity trainings, racial justice work, trauma-informed practice, and lots of other topics that are related certainly to cultural responsiveness. So we've formed and created a resource kind of list with a few resources. There's so much stuff coming out nowadays, so I'm sure you have a lot of work that you can share with folks, but we wanted to provide a little something that can also support your knowledge and sort of understanding as you navigate these times and support young people. Great. And this is actually, I added this at the last minute. This is for Boston. So just wanted to look specifically at the data around race and ethnicity and the way that, this kind of overlaps with a lot of the young people we serve. I know we're serving mostly Black and Latino youth across the city. And so looking at the way that these pandemics are kind of affecting families, affecting young people. And it's important to understand kind of what's happening in the data so that we can inform our relationships and inform the work that we do. Great. So now we're going to hop into and launch into understanding some shared language to think about the work, think about how we form culturally responsive relationships. And I wanted to define two terms that we've thrown around a lot already, culture and cultural responsiveness. So for us at MMP, the way that we define culture is a shared, learned symbolic system. It includes values and beliefs and attitudes, and it shapes who we are, our perception, our behavior, what we see, how we operate in the world. So if I'm thinking about culture and I'm thinking about where culture shows up, where do we learn it? What are some places that our young people, that we learn culture and those beliefs and those attitudes? Where do we get that from? If folks want to share in the chat, just kind of rattle off some of the places that we pick up culture. Family, school, society, home, media, right? Huge place.
Social
media. Mm-hmm.
friends, neighborhood, grandmothers. I'm getting close to grandmotherhood. That's why I keep highlighting the grandmothers. Church, leadership, school. Yeah.
Great. Politics, yep.
Yeah. I'm going to also add things, music, art.
Books, media again, right? So those things that those values, those beliefs, those attitudes, we're learning them constantly. We're picking them up from the moment that we're born, right? We're transmitting ideas about who we are and about who other people are and the way that we engage in the world. For us, it's not that we want to pretend that culture doesn't exist. We're served by culture. Culture is a good thing in many ways, right? And we all have, Janine doesn't have necessarily a culture of one, right? It's a set of beliefs that I share with other people. And so depending on which identity I'm thinking of, I have a cultural identity, I'm Black. So there's a community identity that, for me, Black Americans share in some regards. We're not all the same, certainly, but there are certain aspects of that particular identity based on our lived experience and the ways that our experiences have shaped our world that have some values, beliefs, and attitudes and perceptions and color the way that I walk through the world, right? So acknowledging that, and we're going to do some work to kind of think about our own kind of identity and culture and the place that we sit, is really important as we lead ourselves to cultural responsiveness and think about how we can genuinely embrace, work with, and continually learn about cultural differences. So it's not to deny or pretend that these differences don't exist, right? It's really to lean into that and think about how do I set myself up on a path of continual learning and growth. The reason why we use the term cultural responsiveness and not necessarily cultural proficiency or competency is that we don't believe that is something that you just like check off a box and you're competent in, right? You're constantly learning new things, meeting new people, having new experiences, and it's a lifelong road that we're all on together, right? So really thinking about how do we not only acknowledge the difference, but respond appropriately, right? So that we can support young people, affirm who they are in those moments that we're building relationship with them is important. So that's why we frame it that way and use that term. Once we understand how young people might have specific needs based on cultural identities, then we can work towards, again, being in better relationship with them and being culturally responsive so that they have what they need, and we're able to provide that from our perspective. So with that as the basis of our kind of terms that we're going to be using, we want to jump into some activities to help people explore who they are and our own identities. We have this iceberg concept of culture here that we share just to also highlight some of the things that we immediately think of when we think of culture, right? Food and dress and some of those things that are really evident and let's say on the surface. But when you really dive deep down a little bit more, this concept of culture like an iceberg, I've seen onions, I've seen trees, I've seen lots of different graphics to define this, but understanding that there are lots of ways that culture shows up in our lives that we may not even think of. So I see Beth has the pointer there and pointing to certain things. Tempo of work, eye behavior. Do you look at someone in the eyes? Is that rude? Is that appropriate, right? Depending on culturally where you're from and the way that you've understood things. Ordering of time. The way that you actually think about time and the way that time is valued, being on time, being more relaxed about that, right? Work ethic, and sort of the way that, we order everything in the world. Concept of self, right? So individual versus communal, and the way that perhaps we think about, building our communities and leadership. What does that look like? So you see there's a lot under there. You have this in your workbook if you want to explore. But again, we use it as a tool to think about, all right, so I see this young person, I see myself, and there are certain things that we understand. But when I really take a deep dive and start to think through, why do I behave the way that I do? What are the attitudes that I hold? A lot of this stuff embedded in those institutions and those systems that we named is part of culture and cultural identity.
And I just like to point out that I guess, and I think that any of you have done this work for a while, I think each time I come back to this iceberg, I go, oh my goodness, the way I've addressed somebody and not thought about something. And you can go deeper and deeper and deeper in this over time, more and more and more, because also, because this is deep and you can understand it differently over time. And you think you might understand it one way, and then the more that you understand the person that you're interacting with, you can learn more and more about them. And as they interact with a world in which they're attending to the dominant culture, they might not share all that's below the surface. And so as you get to know someone, they might be putting all this to rest. But then as you get to know them more and more, you start to learn more about what's important to them and how they think about things, and what they want, how they want you to really interact with them more and more deeply as you get to know them, and as they start to share their true self, and as they kind of let you see who they really are, as trust builds over time. So, they're even just like theory of disease, how they think about illness and wellness. And right now with COVID going on, you might never have even noticed that about somebody, except for what's happening in the world right now. This might be a huge issue. And we might be missing it. So I think you think we get it, and then we have to look again at this iceberg and reflect more and more and more. This work never ends.
Great. So we want to hop into our first activity, and for folks who have the workbook in front of them, this is on page 3, 4, and 5. And we wanted to start again with an exploration of our own culture, our own identities, and have a little bit more understanding of who we are and how who we are shapes the way that we build relationships. So what I'm going to ask folks to do is we're going to look at these lists, right? So on page 3, there's a chart that has historically included groups and historically excluded groups. I want to say with that chart, it is written from a very American Western context, right? So there are some groups that might be missing. There are some groups that maybe you would sit in that you might add to the chart, and feel free to. But that chart, borrowed from actually, I think, Visions as an organization who does great sort of cultural responsiveness, anti-racist work, is a way for us to start thinking about some of the common identities and common dimensions of identity that we all hold in various ways. On pages 4 and 5, what we're going to ask you to do, so first we're going to reflect kind of together and look at these lists, and then we're going to put you into pairs in breakout groups to have you discuss with your colleagues some of the key questions that you see on that worksheet. But I want you to first, and I'll walk you through the 2 parts of it, and then we'll put you in breakout groups. First, on page 4, it asks people, looking at the list, to think of all the historically excluded groups that you have been a part of. And you see we have this list up here so you can reference as well in case you don't have the workbook. So groups like, if you're a person of color, if you identify as a Vietnam vet, immigrants, taking a look at that and checking any group that you are currently a member of or have been a member. And I want to highlight that that's important because you see, let's say, children on the list, right? Thinking about age and thinking about the ways that young people have been excluded historically from society, from decision-making, from having access and power. We were all children at one point. So in theory, everyone should check children on this list. And so for the rest of the identities, take a look, see which one that you might check off that you have been a member of or are currently a member of. And so we'll give folks a moment to think about their excluded groups before we hop on over to the included groups. And we're going to do the same for our historically included groups, right? So these are the groups that in this context, in our American, very Western context, this group of folks traditionally have power and access in our world. And so you'll notice things like management supervisors, formally educated. You know, if I think about myself and some of the places that I might check off in historically included groups, English as a first language, dominant language. So take a moment and check off your historically included groups that you are currently a member of or have been a member of.
And if you don't have your workbook, you could just be writing these down on a piece of paper. You can do this without the book.
Yeah, for sure.
Sorry, I'm a paper person.
Yeah. So as we get ready to break people into groups, I will read aloud the questions that you are going to discuss in your breakout groups, and they are referenced on page 4 and 5 of the workbook. So we're gonna give you a solid, amount of time to be able to do this with your partner. We want you to, with a partner, share kind of what you're comfortable with, certainly, which groups that you maybe checked off or identities, 1 or 2, but focus on one of the groups and reflect with your partner some strengths that come from your experiences as a member of one of the groups, right? And then think of a time that for the excluded groups you were treated as less than, and if you're thinking about the included groups that you were treated as either more than or better. Right? So we want you to think about, if I'm thinking about my historically excluded group and I'm selecting one particular identity, I might say people of color, right? I identify as Black. Thinking about an experience where I was treated as less than, just an example, I had an interaction with my landlord where it was a microaggression, but we needed a third roommate and they were harping on us and had not done this previously when I lived in my apartment for 7 years, and made an assumption that me and my other roommate, 2 Black women, could not afford the third rent if we did not find this person. And in such a way that it colored the experience that they were micromanaging us, finding another person, and made some assumptions about our ability to do that and our ability then to be able to cover the rent in a way that really the relationship turned a little sour in that moment, right? So that experience, I believe, right, having lived through that experience with my white roommate, that because we were 2 Black women, that experience looked different because I was a person of color, right? So we want folks to kind of reflect on, again, the experiences that they've had in specific groups, because that then will lead us to some reflection on how does that influence you in relationship with young people, right? So who I am as a Black American woman from, not from Boston, certainly colored my experience working with those young girls at the Winthrop School in Dorchester, right? I was a Black woman, I am a Black woman. In relationships, sure, I have something in common with those girls, but growing up in the suburbs of New Jersey and not necessarily understanding that experience of growing up in a city, going to an urban school, there was a disconnect there that I had to recognize and overcome in thinking about relationship. So we want you to spend some time with your partners reflecting on your experiences in both excluded groups and included groups, and ultimately thinking about how those identities and those experiences shape your relationships or your ability to be in relationship with young people.
Any questions before we break you down into groups?
How much time do we have in breakdowns, just so we know how to split it, maybe 50-50?
So we're gonna do about 10 minutes, right, Beth?
Yeah. And we'll tell you in 5, if you look up at the top, when you go into your breakout room, there'll be a banner at the top and we'll tell you in 5 minutes is up.
And can you put the questions in the chat?
Sure, absolutely, I'll do that.
Actually, when you're in the breakout room, you won't see the questions. So we will post the questions in the banner as well. Welcome back, everybody. We're gonna be filing in. There's 30, what did I say? How many did I say there were? 30.
Look at group 12, first one back.
Yoo-hoo! You ran down that hallway. All right, 11. People are running in. Coming back. Hey, Joelle.
That was too fast.
Hello.
No, too fast.
I know, you could sit in that break room all day
Mm-hmm.
because it's so comfortable in there, and you know, out of your usual space.
That was a great exercise.
Lovely. Good work.
We're gonna have a minute. We're just gonna wait for, okay, 39 people. That's how many we are. So I'm gonna ask, let's give ourselves a minute to talk a little bit. So I'm gonna ask you, I don't know that, so in the bottom of your screen, there's something called reactions. Does everyone see that? And there's actually a thumbs up and a hand clap. I'm just gonna use the thumbs up little thingy doer. That means you wanna speak. I know there's a way to raise your hand. I don't know how to do that though. And if you, so just to help us so everyone can speak, I just love to know like any thoughts that came up for you by doing this exercise, or something that you'd like to share without sharing. Don't share what your partner shared unless you have permission to do so, but thoughts about what you heard or how it felt or what came up for you doing this. Anyone want to take a minute and share? Okay, don't get scared by my little, you can raise your hand if you'd like to, your real hand.
There.
Hey, Jackie, yay.
It was interesting when I started talking about it, when I listed my historically excluded and my historically included groups. A lot of my historically excluded groups are from my past, but they're the ones that I consider more deeper part of my identity, and that the ones historically included groups that are new to me feel like they're very new to me, even though they're now getting to be 20 years old, a part of my identity. It still feels new, like being middle class and being formally educated and being management.
Yes. So even though you're in that included group now, your full identity isn't that. Yeah. And what does that mean for you though? How does that play out in your work with young people?
I feel more, even though I'm an older white woman, I feel more in line with my students than I do on the senior staff I serve on. Anyone who knows my senior staff, don't share that secret.
Yeah. And you know, that's interesting. Oh yeah, wait, I saw a hand. Leo.
Hi, I was talking with my breakout partner, and we were both talking about sort of the positive things of identifying as a person of color, and that I shared, we had Floyd Chung from Mount Holyoke come and visit, and he talked about racial micro-affirmations. When you see someone of another person of color or another person that shares your affinity group, and you sort of nod at them, or you like give a little acknowledgement like, hey, I see you, and that's one of those things that, like, I'm not sure white people have that, where they can like walk into a room and say like, hey, white person, that's like, yeah. And it's a nice thing that turns around the exclusion part of being a person of color.
Yes, thank you. Anyone else want to share something?
Sure.
Yeah, Jonathan.
For me, there was a lot of duality in minds, like in terms of like excluded groups. I grew up, like both my parents are Haitian, so I grew up in a Haitian household, but I was born in the U.S., so I also do have that U.S. experience in being. So like I know for me with my students, that at times has been, you know, also a gift and a curse, you know, in the sense of like I could definitely relate to a lot of my Haitian students, and you know I could use my experiences of growing up in America to help them kind of like transition, because some of them may not have been here as long. But at the same time, there's also some traditional values that we may not see eye to eye in terms of how to be moving. And sometimes that can definitely cause confrontation, especially when I include the included piece of being like formally educated. And I forget that I don't remember a time, where once you learn something, you forget the point where you didn't know it. So I forget at times, like, you're 18, you forget what you didn't know at 18, and considering that they're even in a newer situation than you kind of have to, like, especially you kind of have to check yourself, because as much as you do know, you have to remember that, like, you're still in the realm of teaching and coaching and having to always kind of like check yourself. It's almost having that duality. Sometimes you just forget to check yourself because you just stay on the included side, because you've almost just been there for so long that sometimes you forget your own experiences.
Yeah. Yes. Thank you. And I think that's a great thing about checking ourselves. I was at a training one day, and it was in a community that was predominantly Latino, and a white woman was the teacher there. And she said, well, I grew up in this neighborhood. This is my neighborhood too. And I was as poor, and I lived in the same housing development as these students. I am one of them. And I said, but the children in your classroom see you as a white woman. Like, it doesn't matter what you think you are. It's also how other people see you, right? And so so we have to check ourselves. So we might think of ourselves one way. And so we might be in a management position, and it doesn't matter what color our skin is or where we are. We might be formally educated now, even though maybe we're the first generation of people who have been formally educated. So we see ourselves one way, and other people might see ourselves another way. And that could work in our favor or our not favor, right? So somebody might see Jonathan as a Black man and know nothing about him and make things up about you. And someone might see you as of an educated man wearing a suit, and some kid might go, oh, that guy, he's old. He doesn't know nothing about me. And I don't know, you look like a young man to me, right? You look like a young, hip guy, and I'll say, you know nothing about me. So you know nothing about nothing right now, Jonathan, no matter how you slice it, right? And so it is about us checking ourselves and where we sit and how it moves. And, we were all young once. And like this whole age thing, right? You're young and we have no power. You're in the X group, out group. Then you come into this space where we're in the in group at some age. I don't know what that is. And then elder people are in the out group again. And where are we putting old people in our society? And in some cultures, elders are the most respected people. And in some cultures, we're just like warehousing them, and they don't have any say about what happens in their life. And so it's not always so clear, and we can be sometimes included, and sometimes we have power, and sometimes we don't. And I'm a woman, but I'm white. So I got power, but then I don't have power. And so how I use myself in relationship matters. But if I don't own it, I'm useless. Like, then that's where I'm abusive. If I don't own what I have and understand it and get it, then I'm abusing myself, and I'm abusing others, because that's where it's not, that's not right. Any other thoughts? And I'll tell you, I can do this exercise 100,000 times, and this is like every time I learn something about myself, every time. Claire, is that raising your hand or no? Okay. Because this stuff is deep. And then I learn something new about myself. And then I do something in the world. I go, oh, there it is again. And I have to learn something new about myself again. Like, geez, Beth, didn't you learn that again? Like, didn't you learn that when you were 30? Didn't you learn when you were 40? No. I got to learn it again and again and again. And I learn it from people around me and my interactions with people all the time. So oftentimes we do this, another activity very similar to this, because sometimes we don't know what groups people are in, because we make assumptions just by looking at them. I don't know who's a veteran. I don't know people's abilities. I don't know people's immigration status. I don't know people's generations, how they got here. Sometimes we take people's stories, and before I even know them, I step on them without knowing anything about them, because I make up things about people, and I kind of avoid those parts of who they are. We call it like stepping on pieces of who they are without even knowing them. And unfortunately, big older people do this to young people all the time. And I always use this. How many times have people said, pull up your pants? If you want to get anywhere, pull up those pants. It's like, we just totally took someone's identity and went squash without any respect. No respect of who that person is. And we as adults think we're helping them. We're like, no, I want this person to succeed. They're not going to succeed if they're wearing their pants below their ass. Well, that's not even true. We have to like listen to them and hear them and understand them. We might have advice as older people, but we just went, someone told me something about myself just without any courtesy of understanding anything about me, I wouldn't listen to them either. But somehow we adults think we can do this to young people all the time. So this is like a really great thing. You can do this with young people and hear how they feel about being included and excluded. And they'll have a lot to tell you. They feel it each and every day, every step that they take. And if we see the leadership of this movement right now, they are taking control. They are leading the revolution. And people are stepping back and saying, go for it, people. These are the change makers, right? We got to give them space and time, because this is how the world's going to change. So think about this: who has power, who doesn't, when they do, when they don't. And think about yourself. And you can hang this up, and it's fluid. Some things never change, and you never move from that power place or the lack thereof. And sometimes you do. Good exercise. Keep it with you. Thank you very much for all your sharing. And I hope the conversation was good. Don't stop having the conversation. You can have it with others, and you can keep it going.
Beth, I think Mike Dennehy was raising his hand.
Mike. Where are you,
Mike,
Mike?
do you want to say something? I think unfortunately he froze.
Yeah, I was going to put it in the chat. I think. Whoop. One identity that I think, am I frozen? Am I good?
You know what, if you take your video off, I bet we can hear you.
Is first gen college, to a first generation college. Yeah. One identity I think that will help, that we should consider is first generation to attend college, especially given the nature of this group.
Yes.
Definitely.
Yeah. Yep. Really important. Thank you. All right, so I'm gonna share my screen again, right? Janine?
Yeah.
All right.
Great. So as Beth works on sharing her screen, we're going to hop back in and review another concept. So as we, have been thinking about ourselves and the work that we do and what we kind of believe and where our worldviews come from, implicit unconscious bias is something that's really important to explore, right? So we're going to share the definition, we're going to watch a video, and we're also going to think about, again, how does that impact our relationships? So in talking about, how you're supporting these young people to be in school, to persist, to be able to go forward as they enter these new spaces and reflect on their identities, right? That's one of the important things that we as adults can do for young folks, is to help them kind of think about, who do I want to be, right? And affirm and accept them for who they are. And to do that, we have to, again, uncover some of that stuff that might even be hidden within us. So unconscious implicit bias, the definition here on the screen. I'll also note that in your workbook on page 7, we have a whole list of cultural responsiveness key terms. I'm not going to go over all of them today, but just wanted to, again, we think language is really important, and having some shared language and common understanding of certain concepts is helpful. So there's a bunch of other terms that, you might hear us mention in the conversation, or you may have heard mentioned in your work before that we wanted to share with you. But for this instance, we're talking about those learned beliefs, attitudes, and stereotypes about a particular group that result in harmful or preferential treatment of members of that group. Some of you might be familiar with the IAT. It's an implicit bias test that I think is Harvard does. You may have done that before. I did that, and it was interesting. My results were that I had a bias against Black men specifically, right? And so here I am, Black woman, raised by Black men, live with Black men, love Black men, and yet even as a person who shares some identity with that group of people, somewhere deep inside me, somehow this test picked up on a bias, right? So it's really about how do we explore those things that we believe, all that stuff under the iceberg, where those messages came from, and how we can then, and what we're going to work on later, is some strategies to be in relationship with young people, to be able to consider, right, different considerations around culture and identity, to confront some of the bias, some of the positionality, and some of the kind of power and privilege that we hold in different ways. So we're going to watch a video. And as you're watching the video, what we're going to ask you to do is reflect, again, what does this mean for relationships? And we'll put up some key questions that we want you to consider. And we'll put you in groups, probably larger groups than you were in before, to really talk about how does implicit bias show up in our work. And I want you to think specifically, I know some of you do a lot of things at your organizations and work with youth in a lot of ways, but in your coaching practice and supporting students, some of which are first generation students, to graduates be in college, finish college, move on to career and, you know, great outcomes afterwards. How might implicit bias show up in your own personal practice and your institutions that you're in as well? So Beth is going to cue up the video. Let us know if you have any issues with sound or picture.
Implicit bias. Implicit bias. 2016 was the year that implicit bias went somewhat mainstream.
Yeah, so when Hillary Clinton mentioned implicit bias in the debates, our phones started blowing up, all our friends started emailing us about it.
But what is implicit bias? Implicit biases are basically thought processes that happen without you even knowing it. Little mental shortcuts that hold judgments you might not agree with. And sometimes the shortcuts are based on race. First, some clarity. Saying someone has an implicit bias is different from calling someone a racist.
The word racist is a highly loaded term, right, here in American society. A lot of times when people are using it, they're thinking of the kind of old-fashioned Ku Klux Klan style racist.
But implicit bias isn't anywhere near that, explicit.
Implicit bias is something that comes out of ordinary mental functioning, out of how the mind normally works.
We've all grown up in a culture with media images, news images, conversations we heard at home, our education. Think of that as a fog we've been breathing our whole life. We'd never even realized it, what we were taking in.
And that fog causes associations that lead to biases.
I somehow know that if you say peanut butter, I'm going to say jelly. That's an association that's been ingrained in me because throughout my life, peanut butter and jelly are together. And in many forms of media, there's an over-representation of Black men and violent crime being paired together.
And because of that, I actually deep down inside have been taught that Black men are violent and aggressive and not to be trusted, that they're criminals, that they're thugs.
With all those associations, I'm not trying to let us off the hook, but in some ways, none of us stood a chance.
Starting today, we'll post a video a day dealing with one challenge of understanding implicit bias and its relationship to race and exploring ways we might combat the problem.
One more thing, if you're seeing this and thinking that it doesn't apply to you, well, you might be falling prey to the blind spot bias. That's a scientific name for a mental bias that allows you to see biases in others, but not in yourself. We're biased.
Implicit bias.
Implicit bias.
Implicit bias.
2016 was the year that implicit.
Great. Thank you, Beth. So in your breakout groups that we're going to put you in a moment, again, how does implicit bias affect your relationships with young people as a coach, as a person supporting them? Where have you seen it show up in your relationships, right? So, you know, really think and reflect, where might some beliefs, some understandings that you have that you didn't realize you had show up in the way that you're in relationship with a young person? Maybe it's in, the way that you spoke to them about a particular topic or whatever, right? And if you can't figure it out for your own relationships, I'm sure we've seen it in programs or institutions, right? One particular example I think of is in policies and procedures. There was a school, I think a few years ago in Massachusetts, that had some rules around like hair. If you were allowed to, because it was a charter school and they were about no distractions, and so students should not have hair that has colors and extensions and this and that. And so there were Black girls in the school who went and got braids because that's easier to manage, right? As a Black girl, I grew up getting my hair braided lots of different ways, and the school's policy dictated that they could not wear extensions. They were applying that policy, I think, unfairly to those Black girls, right? Not realizing that actually this was something that was going to support them, help them to be able to function in school, do sports, whatever, right? And it was also a personal choice, but it was specific to their identity as Black women and the way that they did their hair, right? And so those rules that were made to support and, help students actually were harming students in different ways. So think about, again, your relationships, those policies, procedures, things that you do or that your organization or an organization you've been a part of does, that actually, right, is implicit bias kind of rearing its head in the work. So we'll put you in groups of, I think we're going to do groups of 8 maybe, so there'll be more of you in a group, but think of some examples and how this shows up and affects your relationships. And I'm going to argue that it does. So I think you should be able to come up with some examples. That's why we're allowing you to think about yourself. But if you just can't think of an example for yourself, right, talk about, again, things that you've seen in organizations and programs that you've worked in. So Beth, take it away with the breakout groups. And we'll give you, let's start with 7 minutes. We might go up to 10. We'll do a check-in and see kind of where people are at. We'll broadcast and remind you of the questions as well. But we want to make sure we have time for also discussion when we come back as well, because you all are giving us a lot of great things to think about and chew on.
Okay, ready?
Yeah.
That was so quick.
You're going to wrap up a bit?
Yes. All right, folks are coming back.
They're here.
All right, so I think we're back up to where we were. So yes, it was quick. Our apologies. We want to give folks some time to have smaller group discussion and then share back in the larger group. And we know all of these topics could, as I said, they're lifelong, right? So we could be talking about this for hours and should be, right? And I know you are probably in lots of different ways in your life, personally and professionally. This is a 4 to 6 hour training that we condensed down to 2 hours in a virtual setting. So again, at the end, we're going to ask you for feedback. So please do share any feedback on how we can make this better, which I'm sure will include more time. So in the spirit of that, do want to hear from folks about, what you talked about, specifically the ways that implicit bias shows up in relationships. So maybe, 2, folks, if you want to either raise your hand or kind of share in the chat or unmute yourselves and go ahead and share aloud, if you spoke about, either an interaction you had or ways that you've seen implicit bias either in yourself or, again, in programs that you've worked in. What does this mean for relationship? I'm scanning, I don't see any hands. Maybe people are furiously typing away. But if anyone wants to share what you spoke about in your groups, if you feel comfortable We'd love to hear. Okay, thank you, Portia. I see. They're not me, remembering that when working with young people, a quote from your group.
Someone mentioned that in my group, and I was just like, that's such a kind of powerful statement to share with a young person, that our experiences are different. I probably would have done it different, 20 years ago or whatever, but this is your experience. So let's help shape your experience, not the experience I want for myself.
Exactly.
Even if it is even if it's positive things that I might want for you, let's work on shaping your experience.
Yeah. Right. I think we all enter with the best of intentions and have a way that we know that we walk through the world and processed and did this. If some of us may have common experiences or the experience of, particularly going through college and graduating and what that looks like. But not only is it, just from a cultural responsiveness perspective, important to kind of honor where that young person is at, affirm who they are and the way that they choose to do it, but from positive youth development, right, which you all know, right, helping young people think about how they make those choices, practice that frontal cortex thinking, right, decision making, planning. And so one of the most powerful ways that we could show up for young people and show up in a way that affirms who they are is helping them figure it out, not giving them the answers, not telling them the way to do it, acknowledging that you're your own person, you're going to do it differently maybe than I did it. I mean, I like the way you choose to do it, but I'm going to share with you, right, things that could be helpful and make space for you, really get out of the way so you can lead and create your own path, which is really important.
One thing going off that like our group came up with, or kind of summed up, was like you can't, kind of going off what you and Portia were saying, like you can't coach out of fear, and that fear in itself creates that implicit bias, like in a sense of like seeing the experience that you went through, or an experience that like you've seen another student go through and not wanting that current student to experience that. So you're kind of like almost coaching out of fear instead of, giving them just a perspective, like, hey, like you were saying, like, hey, I've seen this go this way. Not saying it can go that way with you, but, I've seen it go this way if you do X, Y, and Z steps. So maybe you might want to do something different in that sense. And then another thing our group kind of talked about was the almost like telling someone the implicit bias in telling or in conditioning students that there's one way to solve a problem or get an answer. And because then that forces like kind of like a form of like assimilation of sorts, or it's just like you only feel like you can only get this done one way, and it kind of stunts a student's growth, their own growth, because they don't see the other different facets of perspectives that may work for them.
Yeah. Right. So a lot of it, what you're talking about is whether it's out of fear or, again, best intentions, right? But really thinking about how our intent matches the impact, right, of the way that comes across and is transmitted to the student, and coaching or guiding them based on some beliefs or understandings you have about either that experience, that group of young people, the way that you've experienced that yourself, right? And then guiding young people to walk through the world in a very particular way based on those notions and beliefs and attitudes that you have about who they are and who they should be and the things that they should do as a result. Thank you for sharing that. And I just want to honor also Tamika, shared in the group chat, spoke about undermatching students in college advising. Tamika, do you want to say like a small note about that? Say a little bit more just so folks get that.
Yeah, we were talking about just in terms of high school guidance counselors when they're advising students on which colleges they should select, undermatching and telling them that they, shouldn't apply to colleges that they actually could get in because of their beliefs of what the student can do.
Absolutely, right? And I think we see that a lot of, you don't even get told about certain opportunities, right? Because we don't believe that you can access that. And it doesn't seem malicious in a lot of ways, but we know the actual effect and the impact of such, right? When I think about my experience in the school that I went to, my guidance counselor mentioned nothing about Seven Sisters colleges, nothing about women's colleges, nothing about liberal arts colleges, right? And was guiding me towards going to the state school in Jersey, Rutgers, which is a great school, right? I'm sure I would have done well and been fine there, right? But the experience that I had and the way that I was able to shape my future and my world based on the college that I did end up at without his support and without his help, what would that have looked like if I had someone who was able to guide me and support me in entering a predominantly white institution, a liberal arts institution, right? So those low expectations in the way that they show up, it's really important to kind of, again, take a look at, why am I telling this student this? Where is this coming from? What do I believe about this student? What do I believe about this institution? What do I believe about what we should be guiding them to do or not do? So thank you all so much for sharing that. We're going to move along because we want to make sure we get to a point where we're able to practice some scenarios that will highlight some of the themes that you're talking about.
All right.
Beth's going to share her screen again.
Sorry, I'm trying to get faster at this.
No worries.
So I just want to review really quickly, just to show people though about implicit bias. There's two folks from Harvard who had just wrote a book called Unconscious Bias in Schools. I highly recommend it. Sarah Fairman and Tracy Benson. They're great presenters as well. If you're interested, we hope that they speak again at Harvard. But they do this, they go into classrooms and they just observe teachers. Now here, these are teachers that they think that they're doing really good work. And if you look at, they're just watching, like, who do they call on? How do they call on them? So the 0 is when a child raises their hand and they're called on. The X is that they're calling out without redirection. And the R is they're calling out with redirection, okay? So you look at here, this is a Black female who's been called on twice. It was calling out with redirection twice. Here is someone who was a Black male, was called on. The hand raised their hand and they were called on. A white male was raised their hand and they were called on once, and they were calling out without redirection. And here's the white male who was calling out without redirection 3 times. Some teacher never even noticed that this white kid, this white boy was calling out, and the teacher never ever went to them and said, hey, wait a minute, you can't just call out the answers. And here's someone was calling out with redirection.
Beth, what is redirection? I'm sorry.
Saying, no, we can't, noticing that someone's just calling out answers and then saying something to them. Like, you can't call out answers, raise your hand and I'll call on you. So redirection is a teacher noticing that you're doing something wrong, asking you to do something different. So the point is that here's a teacher who's this white male is not getting any redirection. They're just allowed to call out the answers. And here's this Latino female getting a lot of redirection, a Black female getting a lot of redirection, a Black male raising the hand and getting called on, and a white male getting called on and not getting any redirection, just being allowed to call out the answers. Implicitly, the teacher has no idea that she or he, we don't know who the teacher is, or they, we don't know what they're doing. Happens in schools all the time. So also, I just want to point this out, that you also can get feedback. It's really important for you to talk to each other about what you're doing and share your work, because you may in fact be noting like, wow, isn't this interesting? With certain young people, I always do X. With other young people, I always do Y. Like, I noticed in my work, if I didn't have time to process what I was doing with a supervisor, I tended to you know, some kind of young people spoke to me better. Like and it might have been by race, it might have been by gender, it might have been by where they were from, it might have been by their families, it might have been by their immigration status, who knew? But if you look at your patterns of how you help young people, you might find some implicit bias on how you work with them. It's just worth a try.
Great. And so in that vein, and thinking about, again, the ways that we show up in those beliefs that might be hidden, that kind of come out in our work, and have real life implications, right? When we think about the school to prison pipeline, when we think about the way that young students are, you know, discipline is used in schools. Some of these things, right? And again, we're all great youth workers. We love young people. We're in relationship with them. And this is also borrowed from Visions, right? Thinking about the ways, the behaviors, right? So we're moving into strategies and behaviors and the way we can address this, and identifying exactly what are ways that this shows up for me. So you see we have these modern ism behaviors because we're at this point, right, thinking about microaggressions, thinking about the little subtle things that might be happening, sometimes not so subtle, being able to identify in your practice, how do I practice dysfunctional rescuing? What are ways that I just swoop in and save kids, right, without asking them what they actually want? And then what is the alternative behavior to what I've done? And so blaming the victim, right, how we might do that in terms of when we look at young people, families, communities, and their challenges, right? And some way we make them wrong instead of actually saying, let's think about where the responsibility lies, how we practice problem solving and support them in problem solving. Avoidance of contact, which hopefully we're not doing, but a lot of times, right, we're not exactly sure how to work across difference and how to do this work, we just avoid altogether, right? So it's like, you know what, I'm not really sure how to support that man of color, that Black boy, right, young Black man, because that wasn't my experience, so let me just push him to the man of color who I work with, which understandable, right? People, in a lot of cases, representation, that's really important, having common experiences. But if we find that we're doing that over and over and over again, and we're sending a certain type of student to a certain person or a certain place in an organization, really exploring what is that about me, right? So again, I think we do that with good intention, but making sure is that, are we afraid to learn the skills that we need to support that student differently and in the way that they need to respond to them? Or is it that, oh, I really think that they should work with such and such because he knows about their challenge more particularly, right? So denial of differences, again, not noticing, not identifying, not understanding the significance of those differences, really harmful as well. And so the alternative behaviors is something we have to practice, is something that we have to really explore. How does this show up in our work? So I wanted to share that. You also have that in your workbook. It has a little bit more explanation in the chart, but wanted to identify, again, behaviors that we actually do that are harmful and ways that we can then pivot and kind of reshape, reframe that behavior. Any questions about that? We'll move on to the next chart. And so when we start thinking about change strategies, and we're going to next share a framework for building a relationship with young people, and we'll explore that through the lens of cultural responsiveness. For us at MMP, we want to highlight and explore that we think there are four kind of places as you do your work and you think about supporting young people and building relationship that we can explore. So personal, right? So your own thoughts and feelings, increase in awareness, openness to learning. Trainings like this is what we're focusing on. How do you personally first take responsibility and own your own stuff so that you're more effective and you understand the ways that you need to do better, show up differently for young people. Interpersonally, right, also related, then those behaviors, the communication patterns, practicing those skills. Institutional, right, referencing that policy about the hair, right? So looking at where are the structural barriers, what are the processes, what are the places that we're creating challenges for young people. And then culturally, right, which I think is really challenging, but also important. How do we change the culture of an environment, right? Make sure that it's represented and welcoming to diversity, utilizing, celebrating differences, that equity is a key kind of framework that we're using in these institutions. what we want to highlight is that for you all, thinking about where do I do this is really important, right? It's hard. I think it's important that it happens in all places, but how do we figure out where we are in our practice and are able to then identify, you know what, I'm going to start with the personal because I can control that, and I'm going to read more, I'm going to learn more, and I'm going to do better before I then think about the institutional. There's not one particular way that you have to approach the work, but being able to identify in these kind of areas the strategy, because the strategies look different for each area. So as we're thinking about the developmental relationship framework and doing this work, are there places in your personal practice that you need to have a lens of cultural responsiveness, learn more, change your skills, explore your implicit bias? And then what does it look like to make a plan to do that versus, my organization, I'm not sure that we are actually affirming who these young people are. I'm not sure that we're actually doing the work of, in the words of Tori Houston-Surdan, purifying the air and clearing the water. She's a scholar and a practitioner out in California who talks a lot about critical mentoring, about having critical conversations with young people that acknowledge, right, that context, all the stuff that we were talking about at the beginning, what's going on in the world, and setting up our programs, our institutions to support young people to navigate that world, to address it as well, right? So doing the harder structural work of addressing the inequities internally and supporting young people to do that externally and doing it yourself. That takes a different kind of work than I'm going to go do some research, right? It takes work building, working across your colleagues, working with leadership. And so exploring what are the ways that I do this? Who are my allies in doing this? Who's in the organization? Who are my colleagues who can support this work? What kind of support do I need? Is it more training? Is it money? Is it hiring different staff? So there's lots of different strategies and kind of ways that you can explore this, and we'll talk about it through the lens of relationships, looking at actions that you individually can do next, but just wanted to highlight and kind of share this as a framing to think about what might my next steps be to deepen my work and support really cultural responsiveness across the board. Are there any questions or thoughts about that? I want to make sure we pause and take a moment before we move on. All right. And so what we're going to do for the rest of our time together, right? We're going to explore this framework, developmental relationships. For those of you who've done some work with us before, you might have seen this, you might have explored this, you might know the Search Institute. This is on page 9 in your workbook, 9 through I think 13, but they're all here for us to explore. So these are, if you think about the Search Institute, they're out in Minnesota. Folks might be familiar with the 40 developmental assets, right? So they do a lot of research to figure out what do young people need to be successful. They came up with that list of 40 things and then, shared them with youth workers, parents, teachers, and it was great. And we looked at our programs and thought about how do I build these assets? And then said, I can't check off a list of 40 things every time I'm working with young people, right? And the Search Institute also said, okay, well, how do young people build the assets? And took a deeper look, talked to young people, surveyed, I think, about 26,000 young people, and found that it's through relationship, right? It's through interactions with adults that we form these developmental, really intentional relationships that shape young people's identities and support them to be lifelong learners, to have growth mindsets. And so these are 5 actions that we can do as adults and should do for young people. The important thing to note is that young people, right, have lots of people in their lives who do this for them. They get this in church, they get it at home with their parents, with siblings even, peers, right, with other adults in their lives, and they should have a web of support, hopefully, where adults, they get these things in lots of different places. So it's not for us to be the be-all and end-all for every young person that we work with, but to be but one adult, right, who's practicing this framework for them. And young people, hopefully, some of the work we do in M&P is helping young people identify where does this happen and where might I have gaps that I need to then go out and identify some mentors, some support to be able to do this. So let's walk through.
Real quick, Janine, I just want to interject, and we're going to be ending around 12:40. So just want to let people know if they have a hard stop at 12:30, feel free to head out, and we'll make sure to send the recording out. But just want to put that out there. Thank you.
Thank you, Juan, and thank you all for the flexibility to go a little longer. So we're going to highlight just really quickly and summarize these, because what we want to do is put you in groups to play with it a little bit and come up with some strategies. So the first one is express care, and these are in no order, right? But this is basically, do I like young people? Do I care about them? do I listen to them? Am I warm? And it's like, I shouldn't have to say that, but sometimes, right? I've been in settings where I've observed or seen teachers, youth workers, people, and you have to ask, like, do you actually like these young people? Do you want to be around them? Do you really like this interaction? And are you encouraging of young people? The next one, providing support. So helping, and this is, thinking about your coaching role, navigating through hard situations and systems, empowering young people, building their confidence, and advocating on behalf of young people and supporting their self-advocacy skills, and also having some boundaries, right, to help keep them on track. Challenge growth, expecting the best, setting that bar high and helping young people meet it, holding them accountable. And again, that growth mindset. How do we reflect on failures? My intelligence, what I can do is not fixed. I can keep growing. Next is sharing power, right? Which sometimes is really challenging for us to do as adults. If we think back to that list and think about places we have power, places we've been included and excluded, young people in a lot of ways don't necessarily feel like maybe they have power in our world, right? So respecting them, taking them seriously, treating them fairly, involving them, collaborating. We talked about not, solving problems for them, and just getting out of the way and letting young people lead. Expanding possibilities, which I think is a lot of your work, right? Obviously, and thinking about college and career. So inspiring young people to see what's out there, what's new, broadening horizons, and also connecting them. Again, we're not the only people, right? So how do we connect young people to other folks in their lives who can also support them and be in relationship to help them be successful? And really quickly, this, you don't have in your workbook, but you'll get this afterwards. In their surveying of 26,000 people, what they saw, young people specifically, they asked young people, where you get these 5 actions, these 5 pieces, often or very often. And if you look over, program leaders is where I will put us all at, right? So as you reflect on the framework and think about, what am I good at? What do I do really well? Which of these would young people, if I asked the young people that I worked with, would they say they get from me? Oftentimes, all of us will be like, we express care, we do all of these, we're wonderful, we're great. Young people who they surveyed, you'll see 54% said often or very often for express care, right? 67% for challenge growth, 50% for provide support, 52% for share power, and then for expand possibilities, which really for y'all and the work that you do is a large part of it. Only 40% of the young people who they surveyed said this. And we share this, right, to note that there's a disconnect possibly between what we believe that we're doing and what young people are actually receiving from us. So it's that difference between the intent of our work and the actual impact of the work. And I think when we think about cultural responsiveness, right, and using that lens, this is where it can really come in, right? For lots of different reasons, there might be ways that we're showing up and we believe that we're doing this, but are we responding and doing it in a way that the young person can receive and understand? And do we understand the ways that that happens? So you'll see in your workbook, you have cultural considerations when you're looking at all of these pieces of the framework to really identify, it's not just expressing care, it's not just like showing up. How you show up and how you let that young person know you show up sometimes depends on what showing up looks like for them based on their experience. So one, example I'll use for some young people, especially when you think about trauma and some of the experiences that they've had in their life, they may not have had great experiences with adults showing up all the time, right? It may have been challenging, right? There may have been situations where adults didn't show up or adults may have harmed them. And so you saying, I'm going to be there, I'm doing this, and framing your care in that way, that young person may not either, that because they've had an experience where young people or adults weren't consistent, may not know how to receive that may not kind of go over in the same way, right? When we think about how young people interact with other adults in school, School may not have always been a great place for young people. So you supporting them to now go into more school and thrive and be really, achieve in that space, thinking about the ways that you talk about school, the way you support those experiences, you have to reflect and understand what was their school experience like prior to college. And then your work might shift as you respond to support them differently. So just want to throw that out there. As you think about what we're going to do, it's going to be super short, unfortunately, but we want to spend just a little bit of time in groups before we end, reflecting on 2 scenarios. So thinking about the developmental relationship framework, thinking about cultural responsiveness and having that lens as we support young people. These are 2 scenarios that we kind of came up with, and we're going to split you into groups so you can choose either one. And we want you to note and identify what are the ways that I am going to support this young person. What are the actionable, tangible pieces of this framework that I'm going to take and use in my coaching of this young person? So I'll summarize their experiences, and then we'll put you into groups so you can kind of play with this a little bit. So Michael's a student from UMass Boston. He's from Mattapan. His family is Haitian. He's Haitian. Doing well. He wants to be an engineer. During a check-in, he talks about this opportunity to visit Raytheon with the engineering club, right? Only 25 students are selected to participate, and because they, go to Raytheon, then it puts them on this track to get internships, right? As a result, they build relationships. Professor suggested he sign up, but Michael's sure that he's not going to be chosen. He doesn't think he'll make it. The deadline to apply is tomorrow. So Michael, you're working with him. How are we going to support Michael? Then Janelle, she's English high grad from JP. She's at Bunker Hill. She wants to be a nurse. Your friend is a nurse practitioner at MGH. So you're like, I'm going to connect them, right? You've agreed to connect, Janelle, not Renee. You share her contact info. You suggest that Janelle reaches out. You catch up with your friend and you find out that Janelle has not called or emailed your friend at all. She hasn't reached out. You plan to discuss this with Janelle at your next check-in. And these are also in your workbook if you want to reference them. So Beth is going to put folks into breakout groups. And we want you to think about, again, using these 5 actions, what does it look like? What considerations might I need to have to best support this young person? And name those things, right? So if I'm applying a culturally responsive lens to relationship building, what does that look like in my check-in when I support these young people? So Beth, I'm going to turn it over to you to break out in groups.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to put you in rooms, and then I'm going to move some people around because I see that there was some problems before.
Oh, no. And we know, again, that folks are heading out, so maybe a little larger groups in case people do break off because we understand. You gotta do what you gotta do. So we'll put you in groups and then we'll broadcast and let you know. So really just quick highlights. Pick a story, either Janelle or Michael, right? Michael is saying he does not want to apply for that opportunity at Raytheon because he doesn't think he'll be accepted, even though his professor suggested. Deadline is tomorrow. Janelle, you connected her with your friend who's a nurse practitioner, but she hasn't followed through yet. You're going to meet with her. What do you say? What do you do?
1, 2, 3, 4.
And Janine and Beth, this is Elizabeth. We're down to 14 folks, so I wonder if maybe we
just do this
one large breakout group.
Yeah, put you in groups of 3, in 3 groups.
Well, Beth, do you want to just discuss it really quickly, just in large, and so we don't even bother with the breakout room?
Yeah.
All right, great. So thank you all. Thank you for noticing that. I think we were so like, let's do the breakout rooms that we didn't notice that, more than a third of the group left, which understandably. So those who are still with us, what would you do? Let's talk about Michael just briefly, thinking about the framework, all that we've thought about, our positionality as coaches in the world. What do we say to Michael? And what do we think is going on with Michael, first of all, right?
This is Portia. I think, so I usually go into a conversation like this with just asking the student a bunch of questions, because I'm wondering if he was not able to get previous opportunities. I'm wondering if, someone told him that he wasn't good enough for engineering or what have you. So I would want to know from Michael why he thinks he wouldn't be selected. And then thinking about, hey, what does the application even look like? And then maybe he knows, or maybe he doesn't know. So, I'm also thinking like, is there some just self-confidence issues at play? So I think just talking with Michael, I'm trying to figure out like what's at play. Is it his own, confidence? Does he not think that he'll be able to get the application done in time? Has he not gotten other opportunities? So this might be stopping him from applying to this opportunity. So just trying to figure out what Michael is feeling.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you for sharing, right? So really listening, right? Starting with those open-ended questions and exploring what's going on for Michael. And I heard you name a few things, right? As we think about supporting young people having that lens, right? Michael might be feeling, we'll say, imposter syndrome, right? Do I belong here? Right? He's a Haitian American young person at school in an engineering program. What I know about engineering is that we don't see a lot of always men of color, folks of color, right, in that particular field. So who is he surrounded by, and what does he then believe by either what he's been told explicitly, like you said, or that just he's feeling from, based on some experiences he's had before. So supporting him and kind of rooting that out and helping him to understand and be more confident, or saying like, all right, this application, what does it even look like? Because I think it's important that you didn't know with like, all right, the application is due, let's start, we're going to fill out the application come hell or high water, because that's what you need to do, right? So really exploring where Michael is at by listening, by asking questions, and by considering some of these things that might be going through Michael's head based on his experiences, or some things that we understand and know, right, about possibly his experience in college, in the program specific to who he is and the work that he's doing in school, I think is important.
I think when we think about those 5 areas though, I think sometimes, and I've heard this from a lot of young people, that somebody else held up the belief that I could do it before I did. Mm-hmm. Challenging growth, right? And when I hear young people like that area, like who's going to hold the bar just that much higher for me than I could hold before? So sometimes you need the person to go, you know what? I think you could do this. And I believe in you. And I've heard a lot of young people, when I ask people like, who did this for you? Even adults, they say, somebody held it when I couldn't hold it for myself. And so I think that's like an amazing thing that coaches can do, is I'm going to hold out hope. I'm going to hold belief in somebody when they don't have it for themselves at that moment. And on the reverse side of that coin is, how do we interpret failure? That was another piece of that pie, that sometimes when you don't get what you want, that's not the end of the world. And you see, in our lives and in our white supremacist culture, you either win or you lose, but there's a lot in between there. And just because you don't get that one thing doesn't mean that that's not your identity. And so how do we help young people to navigate that? And I think when I look at that pie and I hear people talk about who helped them to get through, that's often the person who helped that, when people reflect back, it was those people who could do both those things for them. Pick themselves up, go on. I am not, my identity is not rooted in only my successes and only my failures. My identity is in who I am.
Going off of that, oh, sorry.
Unfortunately, I think on that note, I'm going to have to interrupt us because we are at 12:40 and we've already gone 10 minutes over our promised time. But thank you, MMP, for a wonderful, very engaging, very provocative session. We will share the materials that you have used with the group. So thank you for letting us do that. And for the rest of you, we will see you tomorrow for day 2, when our conversation will be about higher ed.
Okay. Can I make one small ask? I'm going to send you, and I think I already sent it, a link for an evaluation. If you don't mind sending that out to
Absolutely.
So we can get some feedback.
We'll include that for sure.
Thank you so much. And
thank you guys again, everybody.
Everyone be well and take good care.
Bye.
Thank you.
We appreciate all you do.
Thank you, Beth.
Right
Thank
back
you,
at
Janine.
Bye.
It takes a village.
Thank you.
Bye.
Shall I end this this Zoom?
I guess so. Yeah, you're the host now, right?
Yeah.